Hi everyone. In today's lecture, we're going to be focusing on early childhood physical development. We're going to be focusing on children 3 to 5 years old. There are some slides that do just have some visuals, as well as some slides that have additional links to articles and videos. I highly recommend taking a peek at those in more detail to support your understanding of today's topic. Enjoy! For physical growth of our children from 3 to 5 years old, we do see that their torso starts to lengthen and their spine straightens, so they don't have as much as a rounded back as a toddler does. We do see that there are significant changes in their height, so children gain roughly 2 to 3 inches and 5 to 7 pounds per year, and majority of children by their third birthday gain around 5 pounds and around 3.5 inches, and by their 5th birthday they gain around 4.5 pounds and 2.5 inches, and by 6, on average, children have developed around the nation between 40 to 50 pounds, and so we do see that children are becoming more slimmer, and their lower body starts to lengthen. Their center of gravity moves more from the breastbone down to their belly button. So we do see that in terms of the way that children are physically growing, if they're typically developing, that they're better able to engage in more gross motor activities due to this transition from top to bottom. And we also see that children are better able to engage in bladder and bowel movement control. So we see that this is increasing during the early childhood period. This slide just has a little bit of information related to brain development. So fun fact, if you didn't know, by the age of 2, the brain reaches about 75% of what it will look like in adulthood, and around the ages of 5 or 6, it is at about 90%. So remember when we talked about myelination, so when axons are myelinated throughout childhood, that layer of fat or that white matter that is covered to insulate the cells to help speed up that information traveling process throughout the nervous system. This is why it's important to recognize brain development around early childhood, because myelination is when all of those different kinds of signals between neurons are happening, and we see that all of that information that we need, that use it or lose it, is happening. Again, that pruning is when we have excessive dendrites that we don't need anymore, and so we see that when we're not using different parts of our brain, we don't have a use for it, and pruning begins to occur. So if you're to increase the amount of connections that are being made during early childhood, such as language, for example, if you are exposed to multiple languages, English, Spanish, Mandarin, you're more likely to be able to speak those languages than if you were to try to start that around 10, 11. Not that you can't learn languages older, but if you've ever tried to learn a language when you're older, it is much more difficult than if you were to learn that language during early childhood. So again, just keeping in mind what that myelination looks like and why it's important during this time period. This slide also does just have some refresher aspects about brain development and what different areas of the brain support in terms of control and memory. So remember, we have the two sides of our brains, left and right, and we see that the left side is where language is housed and the right side is where spatial skills are housed. This is also where our emotions and emotional regulation takes place, and our ability to problem solve and to think and reason happen on the left side of our brain. And so on the next slide, on slide 5, I have an image that shows the different parts of the brain. So I recommend taking a peek at that so that you can better recognize the different aspects about the brain and what they do. So for example, our limbic system is where we have our hippocampus, our amygdala, our hypothalamus. So amygdala is the part of the brain that registers emotions, particularly fear, whereas our hippocampus is where our memory center is. And so all of these different parts of the brain support us in terms of physical development. Again, depending on the left and right side, primarily some are more connected to emotions, whereas other areas are more directly connected to how we think. But basically, we see that the corpus callosum is the connection between the left and the right hemispheres and how that information travels between the two. On this slide, you'll see we have some gross motor skills. So this is the involvement of large muscles and body parts, including our legs, our arms, as well as our torso. So our torso is included in a gross motor movement. And we actually do see that children are able to walk and run with skill, changing direction, their speed is increased. We see that they're able to run with short strides with their feet barely off the ground. There is a little video clip here that shows children running and kind of what that looks like and how their movements are. We also see that they have increased coordination and locomotor skills, so they're better able to gallop and slide, hop and leap. They're able to engage in different forms of play, so this is where we see a lot more movement and active involvement outside with different kinds of elements of sports included. We also see their ability to have increased positioning, so height and distance. And a fun fact, preschoolers struggle to do sit-ups, but not because of their developing gross motor skills, but actually because they have very heavy heads due to all of that brain mass volume that is taking up space and all of that 75% of their brain being developed at that time. So just fun fact, if you were to ask a preschooler to try and do a sit-up, they may struggle with that because of their brain development. And again, if you were looking for the different skills related to the milestone markers, 36 months through 60 months, they are on the California Learning Foundations. On this slide, we're going to talk a little bit about some fine motor skills. So I did want to include some images of children eating in different kinds of settings because it indicates how there are many different ways that we may engage with our hands and our fingers. And fine motor skills are often utilizing both sides of the brain. And this is also around the time when handiness is fairly set. So we see that children are starting to have preference for their right or their left hand. And this does reflect the dominant cerebral hemisphere that they carry out the motor action. So if I'm more right brain dominant, where my emotions and my spatial skills are housed, I'm going to be utilizing most of my right brain, whereas if I'm left brain dominant, where my language, my reasoning, my problem solving, I'm more likely to use my left hand. And we actually see that only about 10% of kids are left-handed by the time that they're 2. So it's something to consider if you wanted your child to be able to utilize both hands. What kinds of opportunities for fine motor activities and skills are you providing them? So if we were to look at the children who are eating on the bottom picture using their hands, they may be more likely to use both of their hands to pick up their food to eat. Whereas if we have a child who is using chopsticks or a fork or a spoon, they may be more likely to only use one of their hands. And so just to consider that there are many different ways that we may be using our fingers and our wrists and our hand movements to manipulate objects, but eating and daily routines of feeding are one of the first signs that we are using our fine motor skills. We also see that around 48 months, this is when children begin to show gross and fine motor manipulative skills. So this is related specifically to throwing, kicking, eating, and writing. And so even though this is a fine motor skills slide, gross and fine motor manipulative skills include the movement of hands, fingers, and wrists. So in order to throw or to kick, we need to, yes, use our larger muscles of our legs and our arms, but I need to be able to twist my wrist and to twist my ankle in order to kick a ball or to throw a ball with precision. We also see that around 60 months, there's increased coordination in these manipulative skills. So this is also due to, in part, if we have opportunities for these activities to occur. So do we have writing centers and opportunities for different kinds of engagement with writing tools? Do we have opportunities to go outside and utilize a ball to kick or to throw? Do we have activities where we can string beads or where we can pick up different materials and put them into coordinating baskets, for example? So all of the kinds of opportunities that we're presented with will then support increased coordination and skills related to fine motor movements. On this slide, you'll see that I am including some additional motor skills for children 2 to 6 years old. I did want to mention a couple points related to boys and girls and their motor abilities. So we do see that boys engage more in gross motor activities such as kicking and throwing a ball or skipping and galloping, whereas girls are more engaged in fine motor skills and have stronger balance. And so fine motor skills are more difficult to master. And we do see on average that there is increased maturation 6 months earlier in girls than there are boys. That doesn't mean that boys and girls both can engage in motor skills for fine and gross. We just see that there are some differences in females versus males for that. We also see that by the end of preschool, so around 5 years old, 6 years old, that there's greater speed and endurance. So notice here that there is increasing of jumping over things, skipping and galloping. All of those skills are increased with greater speed and endurance after the preschool years. Same with fine motor skills, increasing abilities specifically related to caring for your own body. So the ability to care for yourself, washing your face, combing your hair, being able to tie your shoes. Those are all elements of care. Also, we see that children are better able to engage in drawing and writing. So this hinges on advancements in cognition, planning, and spatial awareness and understanding. On the last slides, we're going to be discussing different factors affecting growth and health. So we're going to go into childhood injuries, nutrition, sleep habits, and emotional well-being. We do see that childhood injuries are more likely to occur around 2 to 6 years old, and that children are at a greater risk than slightly older children for a couple different reasons. One of the biggest reasons is that children 2 to 6 years old are increasing their motor skills and trying out lots of different things. So they are trying out new heights and new volumes of how they move their bodies. They're falling at different rates, and we do see that children are more likely to fall while riding a bike. They're more likely to fall while climbing on a structure. They are using different kinds of tools, so they're practicing with pencils, they're practicing with scissors, they are practicing moving their bodies in lots of different ways. We also notice that boys are more likely to be injured than girls. This is due to the engagement in higher physical activities for gross motor movements. We also see that depending on a child's temperament, if they do have higher persistence, higher intensity levels, that they're more likely to engage in activities that might produce injuries. So if they are wanting to run more, or they're wanting to move their bodies at faster speeds and at greater heights, they're more impulsive or more active, that they're at a higher risk for an injury as well. We also do see that when children are living in low income and poverty, and their parental education is lower, that there are more injuries related to stress. So for example, there might not be as much time for parents and caregivers to monitor their children. We do also see that there are injuries related to drowning or safety concerns when in a moving vehicle or while riding a bike, for example. Children are not as likely, if there is less parental education or more stress, to be wearing helmets, as well as being in car seats with the appropriate precautions set in place, as well as different kinds of monitoring levels. And so it is important to consider that different environmental conditions as well as parental stress can increase the likelihood that child injuries will occur. Nutrition is another area to consider that may be affecting growth and health. So when looking at preschool age children, we do see that primarily there is some wariness of food around this age period, but we can have training for preference of foods early on if we are presented with a variety of different kinds of foods, and children are more willing and able to eat diverse things if we present it to them. Unfortunately, we do see, though, that if children are eating too much sugar, don't have enough fiber, aren't having the proper ratios of fruits and vegetables and protein, that they could engage in overeating or undereating, and that about 20% of children have been looked at in our United States as having struggles with obesity and being overweight by the time they've reached their 6th birthday. And so that's about 1/3 of the US that we're seeing that is struggling with an obesity and overweight problem. And so there are different guidelines that we can look at for children. And so there's one called My Plate, and it supports looking at what children should be eating, when, and how much. We do see that obesity is more frequent than the problem of malnutrition, even though we do want to represent and make note of children who are living in low income and impoverished neighborhoods where they might not have access to the same kinds of nutritional foods as other children. It is more likely that obesity is a frequent problem, and children are more likely to be vulnerable to obesity in low-income households because there are undernutrition guidelines, and parents may rely more on fast foods or quick sources of food that don't cost as much, and so there may be less nutritional value within the foods and the sustenance that children are eating. We also do see that overfeeding is something that does occur, and this is an increased reason why obesity and overweight children may be having issues, because they're being overfed. And so again, this is why it's important to recognize what kinds of foods children should be eating as well as how much. And children may not eat during meal times if they are stressed out, if they have different preferences for food. We also need to recognize that children are going to need far fewer calories per pound of body weight than infants do. So we have to also look nutritionally at the values in food, as well as what is going to be supportive of how big and tall our child is. Sleep habits. So one of the main things that I want to mention on here is the growth hormone. So the growth hormone is something that is released during the time when children are sleeping, and this can lead to them having growing pains. So you may have children who are indicating that they might have achiness around their thighs, their knees, their calves, and this is often occurring at night when that growth hormone is being released. We do also see, unfortunately, that children around the preschool years are experiencing sleep difficulties, and up to 50% of preschoolers, to be exact, are having difficulty sleeping, such as parasomnia. And so this is something that in this video and article is discussed a little bit more. And nightmares begin to occur around the ages of 3 to 6 years old. So there are lots of different parasomnia aspects of sleep. So this is just sleep disorders that involve different kinds of behaviors or emotions. So we might see that children are sleepwalking. We may see that children are engaging in bedwetting if they haven't already been able to have bladder and bowel control during the nighttime. We may see that children are engaging in different kinds of arousal. So they might be waking up in the middle of the night. This could be due to nightmares. So there's many different kinds of things that children may be experiencing that are causing them to have sleep difficulties. Now, we can see that growth hormones released during sleep could be an issue during this time. If children are not getting enough sleep, then there's not as much of their growth hormones being released, and this can then lead to stunts in their growth. So after watching this video, kind of consider, what can be prevented for parasomnia. Can it be prevented? Can it not? Is this something that occurs all the time? How long does this last? So I encourage you to take a peek at this article and video to learn a little bit more about parasomnia and what sleep difficulties look like in preschoolers. Last but not least, we're going to talk about emotional well-being. And emotional well-being can strongly impact children's ability to have supportive growth and health outcomes. So we do see that when children are in emotional states of stress, that stress lowers the production of their growth hormone, and this can increase their likelihood of deprivation dwarfism. And so children can not be getting enough sleep, and not being able to get enough sleep will impact their ability to have appropriate growth levels. We also see that stress and emotional upset are correlated with poor developmental outcomes. You'll notice that on the link that I have here, as well as the image on the last slide, I discuss a little bit about adverse childhood experiences. And so the ACEs study indicates a little bit about what adverse childhood experiences are. So different kinds of stress that children may be experiencing during this time period, such as abuse, neglect, household challenges. And when children have increased adverse childhood experiences, this can impact their emotional well-being and overall health. So if children are not supported emotionally and physically, they may be more likely to not be able to sleep. They might have difficulties with forming relationships. We also do see that there are decreases in children's ability to engage in day-to-day activities. We also see that children are more likely to have overall health problems once they get older. And so there's lots of significant aspects to consider when looking more into emotional well-being and ACEs. And the video here at the bottom goes into a bit of detail with additional resources and talks a little bit about mental health and why it matters for children and how ACEs is strongly correlated with poor developmental outcomes.